Recovery.
We're going.
All right, so Lynn's home watching this.
She is.
Hi, Lynn. Squeeze the baby for me. All right, and we have new people, and now I don't have a PowerPoint to show you my adorable kids. Oh, well. You'll just have to trust me. They're cute. I've got a couple of kids, and they're cute. We've gotten to that point in the year. Well, I'm Adrienne Summers. For those, I won't point you guys out. For those of you who don't know me. And I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving and a good break. I was telling the morning group that some people try to argue that God might not have a sense of humor, or a sense of wit, but, look what we're studying now this week, right after Thanksgiving, After we, prepare our table for our family seated around it, and we're even sometimes worried we're not going to have enough, and then we stuff ourselves to, fullness, and then end up having food for 5,000 afterwards. So, okay, too much put lotion. Let's pray again real quick. Lord, thank you so much for being faithful to get me here just in the nick of time. I just thank you so much that you give us this opportunity. I thank you that you allow us to be a part of your plan and a part of your great work, and that you just allow us to be a part of it and be used in it. I pray that you would use me tonight, help me to speak the words you want me to speak, help me to forget the words you don't want me to speak, and just bless our time together and help us to really open our eyes and help us to really see what you would have us to learn tonight, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, well, to be a Christian means, or it should mean anyway, to seek out and learn about Christ, and to strive to be more Christ-like. And we have the benefit of watching these disciples as they learn how to do this from Jesus. And this is kind of the first stab at it. It's not really any small task to really understand what he's teaching them, because it's so contrary in some ways to what they've been used to. But we're seeing them kind of starting to slowly, very slowly, gain some understanding and putting this understanding into action in everything they're learning. And just with just about everything, when you're teaching somebody how to do something, you give directions, you explain how it works, you explain how to do it. And then at some point you start to back off a little bit, you give them a little bit more independence, you give them a little bit more responsibility, and you maybe make sure you make a few pointers, make sure that they remember the important points, but you kind of start to back off and you allow them to see if they can really retain and understand what they've been learning. And in our scriptures this week, we'll see that Jesus is doing a little less explaining, and he's doing it more exhibiting in various ways and proclaiming who he is with his actions. And he's testing his disciples to see how much they've retained, how much they understand. And also giving them little minor tasks that are growing, responsibilities that are growing, that are going to be more substantial as they take on more of the church administration, more of the responsibility of the church as he is preparing for his departure. So far in Mark, Jesus has been teaching the disciples, and they've retained some of it. And last week we saw him send them out 2 by 2 on their first ministry journeys on their own. John the Baptist has now been killed by Herod and Herodias and that whole lot. And the disciples have returned to bury his body. And we pick back up as they're recounting all about their ministry tours and all the things that they had done and taught. So starting in verse 30, it says, "The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while.' For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away in a boat to a secluded place by themselves. The people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This place is desolate, and it's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves. And he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up the 12 full baskets of the broken pieces and also of the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. Now, it's important to point out that it says there's 5,000 men, but that doesn't even account for their wives or their children, those of them who had them. So it could quite easily have been at least 3 times that many people. So the apostles are all gathered back together with Jesus, and they're reporting back these events. And no doubt they were probably pretty excited about everything that they had done, everything they had seen. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I had been following this guy and I was interested in it, I was amazed by what was going on, and he gave me the power to do things like heal people and cast out demons, I'd be pretty stoked. But Jesus knew that, they'd been through a lot. They were amped up, but they'd been through a lot already on their journeys. They had been through a lot with John's death and burying him, and they would need some time to rest and regroup. The scriptures say that there were constantly people coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. Now, whether or not it was because they really didn't have time to eat, or if they were just so, amped up on things that they weren't really taking time to eat, he knew what they needed. They needed to take a breather and refresh. So they hopped in a boat, and they headed to a secluded place to be by themselves and away from the crowds. However, the large crowds followed. They were desperate to learn whatever they could, and they didn't let up. They actually ran ahead, and anyone who saw them along the way that recognized them on their little journey across the sea, they actually ran to the place where they were going and got to that, no longer so secluded place before Jesus and the disciples. And when Jesus stepped off the boat, he had compassion on them, even though they had interrupted their plans for rest. He said they were like a sheep without a shepherd. Now, sheep are not the brightest animals. They're essentially defenseless, and they're dependent on their shepherd to lead them and provide for them. They can be sweet, but they're kind of known as the rocks, and they don't really have much in the way of defenses. I mean, really, the only thing they have is the flock mentality, where there's power in numbers, and they have their shepherd, and that's pretty much it. Now, I wish I could say that I typically, or even most of the time, responded this way when people interrupt my plans for rest, but I have to say, when I'm, after a day of, putting out munchkin fires and dealing with stuff, and then I have a moment that I'm gonna go rest, or I'm gonna go do something that I wanted to do, that I had allotted this time for, or if somebody interrupts that, it's usually not pretty. I'm not very compassionate with those types of things. Especially at the end of the day, when, I've gone through all the end of the day stuff with the kids, and I've heard about their day, and I've, taken forever to get them in their pajamas and toothbrushed and in the bed, and gone through all the end of the day delay tactics and everything. And I finally, what I think is the last time, tucked them in and said goodnight and gone out of their rooms. I'm settled into doing something, and I'm, maybe it's the study or something, and I'm settled in doing something, and you hear, "Mom!" Yeah, compassion is not my first reaction at all. It doesn't usually happen that way. But, nothing's out of order. Or I'm missing a page. Oh, here we go. But Jesus, his love is perfect, and it's full of grace. And somehow he finds the energy and the love to continue to love on these people regardless. Now, Jesus had been teaching for a while, at least a little bit. The apostles, bless their hearts, apparently thought that Jesus was not being very mindful of the situation. Are you watching me on your phone?
No.
Okay.
Tanya is.
Oh, hi, Tanya. Anyway, so they started growing concerned about the logistics and the fact that they have this mob of people out in the middle of nowhere and they have limited resources and limited options. And Jesus must not be thinking very clearly about these things. And so they felt it was appropriate to tell Jesus what he needed to do. And I just love how Jesus handles it, because he knows, of course, exactly what he plans to do. He has all this in mind. In John 6, 5-6, when it's relaying this story, it says, "Therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?' This he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do." And I do this with my kids, and this is kind of how you do things with small children sometimes, even with some adults. A bulk of like educational kids TV shows, kind of, they ask those obvious questions, those seemingly obvious questions, they allow them to answer, and then they celebrate it when they've got it all figured out, like, what could we do next? Good idea, you did it. And I could just see Jesus going, and I do this with my kids sometimes, like, gosh, what could we do about this? Because I'm wanting them to get the answer. Now, in their defense, they were still learning about Jesus' capabilities, and they didn't have the benefit of our more complete picture of who Jesus is and what he's capable of, and we've had a lifetime of study for that. And they probably were more than ready for a rest. They were probably pretty pooped, and so they figured, maybe they could send these people away, they could tend to their needs, and it would buy Jesus and the disciples some time for a downtime. But basically, what the apostles' hearts were saying is, send them away. We're weary, we can't meet their needs. But Jesus' heart says, bring them to me, for they're weary, and I will meet their needs. So Jesus has a request for them. He says, you feed them. Feed my sheep. And the disciples are representative of the church and the early church leadership. And Jesus is laying the groundwork for their roles in the church. In John 21, Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. He is beginning to pass that torch. Now the apostles, and this is funny too, I imagine if it sounds like they were irritated, and I kind of wonder what their mentality was, but they're like, we can't afford it, we don't have enough, we don't have sufficient resources to take care of this. And they were right. They don't have enough, and they never will have enough. And we will never have enough. We will never have sufficient resources on our own, or there's sufficient ability on our own to do what God's asking us to do. So Jesus asks, what do you have? Now, Jesus isn't necessarily wowed by what we bring to the table. It's kind of like when kids color you a picture and they bring it to you and you have to go, oh, what is it? We're proud of them and we love it, and it's their heart that they've put into it. But it's not that we're necessarily wowed by their fantastic ability, and that's similar. He loves us and he's proud of us and he wants us to take part in it, but it's not. He doesn't necessarily need our spectacular abilities. So he says, bring me your limited and insufficient resources and contributions, because I'm going to do amazing things with them. He just wants our trust and our obedience. Proverbs 3, 5-10 is, especially the beginning of it, is something I have to repeat to myself quite a few times. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. And Jesus is asking for them to bring what they do have, because he's about to make it overflow. So after he gets the loaves and the fish, he directs the disciples to arrange people in groups of 50 and 100. He has them organize them. And again, he's giving them these tasks that's going to be early preparation for them to administrate in the church. He's wanting them to administrate, organize the flock, get them ready. And notice that Mark mentions that they sat down in green grass. He's the only one that mentions this. And it does give us a little clue as to maybe the time of year. It was most likely spring that this was happening in. And it also is a reflection of Psalm 23, 2 that says, "The good shepherd makes us lie down in green pastures." So Jesus gives thanks, and he consecrates the loaves and the fish, and he thanks God for the little that they do have, and he lays it before God in obedience. And he's setting an example for them all to follow, because he knows the amazing things are about to take place. And then he gives the food back to the disciples to distribute. And again, he's hinting at passing the torch of church leadership and church service to the apostles and the people of the church. He doesn't distribute the food himself, but he gives it to the disciples to distribute instead. He's asking them to tend to and to serve his flock. All ate until they were satisfied. And it wasn't that they just ate until they weren't hungry anymore. It wasn't until they just, ate well enough. They ate until they were satisfied. They ate until they were stuffed. And oftentimes in the Bible, we know that certain numbers can have certain meanings or reflect certain things or be kind of a symbol for certain things. And it's 12 baskets that they had ended up left over. And we don't know what size of baskets they are, but even if they were a dinky little basket, they still had more than they started with. So it was still an amazing feat. And most likely, they were probably pretty good sized baskets. But the 12 baskets reflect the 12 tribes, the people of God. Essentially, it kind of reflects who we are as his children. There was 12 disciples that reflected that as well. We just learned of a girl that was risen from the dead. She was 12 years old. The woman with the affliction of bleeding who touched his robe that we just learned about, she had that affliction for 12 years. It's almost like a little love note that to his people that he's attached to each of these things, saying, I'm doing this for you. I care about you, and I'll take care of you. And these baskets overflowing with the leftover bread and fish, it's reminiscent of the manna in the wilderness, how God provided for his people out in the wilderness. He was deliberately drawing a picture for them of who he was. He was proclaiming that he was the promised one, and he coincided with Old Testament prophecy of who was going to come. He cares for and he provides for his people. In the end, everybody was fed, and not just fed, but stuffed. And they had more left over than they even started with because of God's grace and his provision. Now, moving on to verse 45 and on, it says, Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. And he intended to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out, for they saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, Take courage. It is I, do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. So immediately after collecting the 12 baskets, Jesus sends the disciples away by themselves. Now last time, he went with the disciples in the boat. But this time, he had perceived that after that miracle with the bread and fish, he knew what other people were thinking. He knew what the people had intended, and that they had intended to take him essentially by force and make him king. So he sent everyone on their way, and then he went up to the hills alone to pray. Now the disciples were down there struggling against the wind, and they were down there for quite some time. And Jesus wasn't with them, but he was watchful over them, and he prayed for them. It's also another reminder that difficulties like this aren't necessarily a result of disobedience. It's not because you've done something wrong. Just like that last troublesome boat trip they were on, they were obeying Jesus' instructions to the T. And not only were they being obedient, they were persisting in their obedience. Jesus asked them to go across the sea against the wind, against the storm. He knew what was going on. He knew what was going to happen. They probably didn't. But they kept persisting at it. We know it was approximately springtime. We know from some of the other Gospels that it was about dark when they left. So let's say it was maybe 9 o'clock in the evening, okay? If they've been going all through the night, if they've been going and going and going, it's been hours that they've spent out there. But they kept persisting at it. For me, I've got to say, I probably would have been doing it a little while, and I thought, well, maybe we'll go tomorrow. He didn't really say we're going to do it tonight. So I probably would have turned around and gone back or something, just because it was difficult, and I would have thought, well, this is odd. Obviously we're not supposed to do it now. And the Lord may often ask us to do things that are difficult, or they might even seem fruitless when we're doing it. And we might not see any point in it. We might actually see that it's not beneficial at all and actually kind of a pain in the rear. But he knows exactly what he's doing, and he has a purpose for everything. So Jesus went out to them. It was approximately the fourth watch of the night, which is the window of time between about 3 and 6 a.m. So it was probably the most darkest, most kind of desolate and deserted time of night. And again, they'd been laboring for hours. So if they started at about 9 p.m., we're talking at least 6 hours of rowing and fighting against the wind in the middle of the night. So when things looked their darkest, and they felt alone and exhausted, and Jesus kind of seemed out of reach to them, he was still looking out for them, and he was coming alongside them. But he came out to them, and he wasn't coming out to fix things for them or even to directly go out to them, but he intended to pass by them. And I kind of wonder what this looks like in his mind. I know it seems to be that he wanted them to call out to him, so he was going close enough to them that they would call out to him, which makes me wonder, when they were in the boat, it doesn't mention it, but I kind of wonder if they weren't necessarily calling out to him in their trouble. Maybe it's because they were out on their missionary journeys, and they had been given this power from Jesus to cast out demons and to heal people, so perhaps they kind of thought, no, we got this, we can do this, we've got this power or whatnot, and maybe they were trying to do too much on their own. I don't know. It's my own little speculation. But I kind of wonder what Jesus was like as he's going out there. Like, is he just kind of walking on by, like, you're still here. Like, I didn't even know. Because it says he just intended to pass them by. But they did call out to him, in a way, because they were terrified. But he did come out walking on the water, which obviously shows his control, and he's declaring that he's king over all creation. Job 9:8 says, "He alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea." Now, of course, this wasn't talking about Jesus exactly, but this is exactly who Jesus is. This is the Creator. Now, he wasn't trying to necessarily save them from the storm, but he intended to be alongside them and encourage them through it. If we want to get stronger, we have to go through the strain. We have to go through the struggle that will stretch us and build up our strength. He knew the struggle that was ahead for them. He deeply cared for them, and he wanted them to be prepared because it was going to be very difficult. And he knows what lies ahead for each of us and for those who are touched by our lives. He knows what it takes to prepare and refine and strengthen each of our hearts and speak to those who are watching as we go through our difficulties. Now, our goal is usually to get out of the storm and safely to the other side and get through the process as quickly and pain-free as possible. But his goal is the process. Now, they were terrified. They thought he was a ghost. The word used is phantasma, I think that's how it was pronounced, but to me it looks like phantasma, which I love. That's a good word, phantasma. But it basically meant a phantom or an apparition or a spirit. And we're not talking the holy kind. But immediately he sought to comfort them. He said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And he stepped into the boat, and immediately everything was calm. But they still didn't quite understand. They were just astonished, which I still think I would be astonished, even if I did kind of understand. But their hearts were hard. They didn't understand it. But it wasn't necessarily out of disobedience. It was more of maybe a lack of consideration for everything involved, and the lack of correct focus on who Jesus was and what he had done. It's actually a different word used here than the one used to describe Pharaoh's hard heart in Exodus. The hard heart or the hardened heart in Exodus, that word means to grow rigid, to be severe, be grievous, be obstinate. The word here meant to grow calloused, to become dull, lose the power of understanding. Now, exhaustion could have played partial role in it, as well as maybe the pride from being sent out and doing all these amazing things as far as they were thinking maybe on their own in a way. And perhaps they were starting to rely a bit more on their own understanding again. I mean, it was evident during the feeding of the multitude that they were rather short-sighted and they focused only on their own limited abilities and surroundings. I mean, they were there with this problem with Jesus, and they're thinking, gosh, what are we going to do about this? I mean, we're out here, we have all these people around. We got Jesus, we got the guy who can, calm the storm and, cast out demons. He's got all this power, so I don't think he can do anything about this, though. I mean, you would kind of think that they would have learned their lesson, knowing everything that they'd seen him do, and especially the miracle he had just performed hours before. But, I mean, as we well know, it could take a lot of repetition and time for these lessons to really sink in. We can't really blame them. I mean, how often are we short-sighted or forgetful or distrusting of God's providence? Even though we've learned it all too, and we've seen it in even our own lives before. We're just dense and stubborn creatures. Now, what's interesting about Mark's version of this story is that there's a whole little bit that's missing. The part where Peter sees Jesus, understands it's him, and says, if it's you, ask me to come out to you on the waves. And he gets out of the boat and starts walking on water and starts to sink, and Jesus grabs him. And this is, of all the Gospels, you would think that this would be the most involved explanation. And I'm kind of bummed that we don't get to hear Peter's side of it. But because Mark is essentially writing down a lot of what Peter has told him. He's kind of Peter's, protege. And we don't hear anything about that story. Now, there's some speculation that he didn't want to draw attention to himself because he walked on water and, he wanted to focus on the real important miracle worker here, and that's Jesus. And there's also some that speculated that he didn't want to draw attention to himself because he sank. So, but for whatever reason, it's not in here, so we won't cover that bit at all. We'll just pass on by. We'll respect Peter's wishes, I guess. So moving on to verse 53. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored on the shore. When they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran about that whole country and began to carry here and there on their pallets those who were sick to the place they heard he was. Wherever he entered villages or cities or countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. And as many as touched it were being cured. Now, if you notice, they never did get that rest. They had been going on their missionary journeys. They had gone through, taking care of John. And then they had gone through all of the day before, intending to get rest, never quite got it. And then they rode and had physical, difficult labor all night long. And then essentially landed in the morning on the shore, and right away were just flocked by people wanting healing. And they had to be exhausted. And yet, Jesus didn't even stop. He continued to heal, he continued to teach. And by now, people were just flocking to him. He'd healed so many people, I'm sure word had gotten out more and more and more. And perhaps that woman who was healed by just touching his garment might have had something to do with these people who were just thinking, well, if they could just get a little touch of his cloak. But they were all over the place, and they were begging for whatever they could get. But somehow God was sustaining Jesus and the disciples to continue because they didn't get that rest right away. And just as he had provided the food for them to sustain them, he was giving them just enough energy to still see to these poor souls and to bring healing. Now, our provision and our strength and our resources will never be enough. But it is amazing what God can do with our lives when we bring him all we have, we lay it at his feet in obedience, and we trust and obey him to just multiply it, because he'll do amazing things. Let's pray. God, thank you so much that even though you consider us to be sheep, you don't necessarily mean that in a derogatory way. You love us, and you want to care for us in the most tender way possible. I just thank you, Lord, that you allow us to take part in these amazing things that you do. regardless of how little we might have to do with it, that you love us so much that you want us to take part, and you know that it's best for us if we die to ourselves and do these things with you. Lord, I just pray that you'd be with our group time tonight. You'd help us to continue to dig in further and really learn more about what you'd have us to learn from this. And you would help us to continue to build on our understanding so we can get a more of a deeper picture of who you are and what you're doing and how we should react and the things that we should do for you and in response to you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.